Thank you so much, Sherry, and welcome everybody to class. I've done some thinking about exactly how we might assign reading for this class. The New Testament's not a simple thing to assign. Hello, Sessions. Nice to see you. The New Testament's not a simple thing to assign because, as you know, they keep telling the same story over and over again. And so the first four Gospels, I thought, might be because we will be going forward and backward and forward and backward in the text, sometimes looking at one story that appears three different places, sometimes looking at a story that only appears one place. I thought that as for your personal reading, I might ask you if you would read the Gospels. Between now and Christmas, would you do a careful reading with your notebooks? I'd like you to do a reading and writing about the Gospels. I'd like you to really do what we try to do in this class, which is to say, where am I in this story? Each encounter that Jesus has, I'd like you to place yourself there. And you don't necessarily have to grade how well you do, but you might think, what would have been my reaction? Why is this here? Why are these stories all in this chapter together? They're very artfully placed, as we'll discover today as we take a close look at a story, the parable of the two sons. The other thing that I thought that I might do is, rather than have you read in preparation for the class, I would make the class the preparation for your reading. And so what I would like to do is each week I will tell about some stories of Jesus. I'll talk about some passages and maybe talk about some things that I've noticed there, or hear some things that you notice. And then from there, I'd like you to go home and study that further. And so you don't need to worry that if you come to class and you haven't done the reading, you won't know what's going on, because if you don't come to class, you won't know what to read next. So it'll be that'll be the way. Also, I will try to get my act together and list the reading in the blog, in the website. I didn't even get a letter out to you this week, but I'm going to get it. I'm going to get there, I promise. I swear I haven't been sitting around. But but my brain is not quite back in the harness, so that last night I all of a sudden thought, wait a minute, I'm the person who sends out the class letter and no one sent it out. Let's talk about four themes. I'm spending these first few weeks talking about some themes that I felt like were very important as we read the Old Testament. And then, Darrell, will you come here just a moment so that I can give you a little instruction that isn't to everyone? Today we're going to talk about the second theme, which is forgiveness. But I've written the four themes up here, and these are themes that all the way through the Old Testament kept coming back to me as being very, very important. And it just seems to me that we've gone to all this trouble to study the Old Testament, so we might as well use that context and use it deeply as we go into the New Testament this time, and not sort of treat them as wholly different matters. The whole idea of covenants and covenant family is kind of the whole Old Testament, isn't it? We're talking about being a covenant person, and what difference does it make if you're just a believer or someone who agrees, or if you actually are a person who has, through covenants, taken a spot as one of the family of Christ. And we're going to talk a lot about how Jesus takes the old covenants and the way the old covenants were done and turns them on their head, so to speak, and creates the new covenant in his blood. Then we're going to also talk about forgiveness and reconciliation, a great theme in the Old Testament over and over and over. We have brothers, members of families, tribes, we have holy war going on, and we have reconciliation going on. And so we're going to talk about how we learn to forgive. Jesus comes in order that our sins may be forgiven. That's it, isn't it? I mean, that's the mission of Christ. And so the theme of forgiveness, I think, has to be one of the most important themes. And then we're going to talk about grace, because it's one of those words that's a little hard to define and a little hard for us to understand and teach our families what grace means in our daily lives. And to me, grace maybe could be summed up to say how God works with me. Because if he's working with me, it's grace. Because believe me, I don't deserve it. So just basically, God, when he intervenes in my life, or he comes into my life and works with me, grace is in effect. And so we will see examples of grace as they manifest themselves throughout the New Testament, where things that people normally could not do, they are enabled to do. Next week when we talk about the theme of grace, we'll start with Peter walking on water, and we'll talk about the times that God raises us up beyond our normal ability. And then finally, I sort of have a thing that I call the firm mind. But what I mean about that is not just that you go on gritting your teeth, keeping the commandments. That's one thing. You know, when we talk about endure to the end, it sounds exhausting. I feel like I have to sit down. What I want to talk about is a firm mind. What I want to talk about is a person who is a bright, vibrant believer all the way through. So we have those people who get really old and grumpy and are just kind of cynical and hanging on. We have those people who, as they grow older, seem to grow brighter and more full of the Spirit. We want to kind of be that person, right? And how do we keep that firm mind? How do we not let the vicissitudes of life dim that faith and belief that we have in our minds? And that is something that I think Jesus has a lot to say about. He has a lot to say about it right up till the end, right till the Last Supper. And it's something that we started thinking about as we studied the Old Testament, and then we move right on. Now, there may be many other themes. There are so many things that might strike you. And each of you have a composition notebook. I hope that you'll kind of cart it along with you, keep it in your car. It's probably safer to keep it in your car than take it into the house. Then it'll be here next week when you come. But as you're studying, I really would like you to write as you go. I would like this reading of the New Testament to become for you something where you can look back. I start with a personal experience of mine when I was 19 and in a BYU branch, you know. And you can't believe how much I knew about the gospel at 19. I understood everything, you know. I had read them all, the Book of Mormon and everything. And I just knew everything. And so I actually was meeting with my bishop, and I said something about, how frightening the second coming was going to be, and how it just worried me, and, you know, I hoped I'd make it to the celestial kingdom or some kind of thing. And he said, just the language you're using says to me that you maybe have not carefully read the New Testament. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, let me give you a little assignment. He said, take a spiral notebook. So that's just what I've done with you. And he said, and read the 4 Gospels and write as you go what you are feeling, what affects you, what touches you, what reaches you about what you're reading. Just last night, we sometimes have these rough nights around our house. And last night I was awake and a little worried. And so I thought, well, I'll listen to the Sermon on the Mount. That'll put me to sleep. The scriptures always put me to sleep. And so I listened to the Sermon on the Mount, and I was overwhelmed. I mean, there must be 20 topics in the Sermon on the Mount. It's almost impossible to just listen to it straight through. You got to stop. I mean, I would have had to stop and get up, get my notebook out. So I just decided I pushed it ahead to another chapter that wasn't so dense. And this is where to stop. Get your notebook out, read, and when Jesus says, you know, I'll forgive, you know, you have to forgive everybody. You have to do this. You have to do that. I really want you to stop and say, you know, can I even do this? How can I do this? How can I implement this into my life? When he says, don't even worry about the things of tomorrow, you know, because tomorrow will take care of itself, and God clothes the lilies of the field and all of these things. And you think, I'm worried sick about all of these things. And so then you might think to yourself, yeah, well, he just meant that for the 12 apostles. And then you think, well, what if he didn't? What if he's really saying to me, Marilyn, you're spending too much time worrying about stuff that you shouldn't have to worry about if you're in my hands? Dear me, that's a whole new thing. I might have to write a whole page about that. So I'd like you to think about that. I'm doing it with you. I'm writing right along with you. I'm reading and writing. So each week I'll tell you a couple of stories of Jesus. We'll read them together. I'd like you to go home and either in your linear reading through the Gospels or in your reading about some of the things that might have intrigued you in class, I hope you will write and have this be a record. That little notebook to me was very precious. I don't think it says anything profound. But at the beginning of that notebook, I was a believing member of the church, and at the end of that notebook, I was a Christian. I believed in Jesus Christ. I adored Jesus Christ. I only wanted to be anywhere near where Jesus Christ could begin to give me more of the feeling that I had while I read and wrote in that book. And I understood what Dostoevsky said in his way that he had of saying things. He said, if anyone could convince me that Jesus was not the Christ, and if Jesus Christ really did be separate from the truth, I would still prefer to stay with Jesus and not with the truth. In other words, it was more than just a, yes, these are true principles. There was an allegiance to someone you had just learned to love. Bruce R. McConkie says, the Gospels are where we go to fall in love with Jesus. That's what we want to do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this theme of forgiveness. In the Old Testament, we have types of Christ, right? And one of the most unusual types of Christ that's really unexpected is Esau, who is really, not a hero figure. And we don't expect him to turn out to be this marvelous person. But let's just very quickly turn to Genesis 33 and remember, because our Bible translators very cleverly have used exactly the same language to describe this meeting as they used to describe the story we're going to read, so we need to look at it. So we're in Genesis 33. And you know the story. We have Jacob and Esau, right? And they've been apart for 20 years because Jacob has tricked Esau and pretty sure that his mother was pretty sure that Esau would kill him. So he goes away and he ends up being gone 20 years. Well, when he comes back, there's a lot of things that happen as he comes back, and both men, the progression is shown to us through different hints and ways. We won't even go into all of that today, but we will go into their actual meeting. I'm going to read, I think I'll read this from the New Living Translation. I'm going to start right with verse 1. Genesis 33, verse 1. Then Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and his 2 servant wives, and put the servant wives and the children at the front. I kind of like that because Jacob is still himself. He's making a human shield in front of himself. Leah and her children went next, and Rachel and Joseph went last. Then Jacob went on ahead, and he just proved me wrong. He went ahead of everyone. Okay, Marilyn, you misjudged him. And then as he approached his brother, he bowed to the ground 7 times. This is the traditional greeting of the vassal to the suzerain, to the liege lord. So he literally is placing himself far below Esau. We don't have... I'm trying to think if we have any physical manifestations of where we place ourselves socially. The Japanese are all about this, and you can watch little videos of Japanese people bowing to each other. And if you watch, because when they're talking, they'll bow. And if you watch, they're taking turns, one bowing lower than the other. And it's kind of like chickens. They're establishing a little bit of a pecking order while they're doing this. And it's very subtle and it's very well done. My first companion, who was a very, very traditional, old-fashioned Japanese person, I can't show you in front of you, or I'd have to get up on the table. But she made me at every door get all the way down on my knees and put my head to the ground between my hands to greet, because it was a given that I was going to massacre the language and that I wasn't going to get anything that was going on. And so she wisely was having me humble myself completely so that nobody would feel like they needed to knock me down a peg. So I know how to do that. So he's essentially doing that. He's essentially saying, I'm putting myself as low below you as I can. This is huge. Right there, that's huge. So he approached his brother. He bowed to the ground 7 times before him. And then this beautiful Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him, and they both wept. Let me go to the King James Version and read that same verse 4. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And then they go through a whole dialogue about their situation. Esau says, what are all these women and children and all of these people? And Jacob says, these are the children that God has graciously given me. Your children are your wealth, and he's got a lot of them. Then the servant wives came forward and bowed. Next came Leah and bowed. Next came Joseph and Rachel and bowed before him. "What are all these flocks and herds I met as I came?" Jacob replied, "They are a gift, my lord, to ensure your friendship." And Esau says this, "My brother, I have plenty. Keep what you have for yourself." Now think about that when we read the parable of the two sons. Think about Esau's attitude. He has been cheated of his birthright. He's had to make his way in the world. But this is his attitude. He doesn't say, "You stole the birthright. I can't even begin to tell you what the last 20 years has been like." No, he says, "I have plenty. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob says, "No, if I have found favor with you, please accept this gift from me." So they do a little this pecking order thing, and eventually Esau takes the gift. He says, "Well, let's be going. I will lead the way." But he says, the children are young, and so then they go on together. With this in mind, with Esau's attitude in mind, and his willingness not only to forgive, but to just simply put the past in the past. Easier said than done, isn't it? Let's go to Jesus and Luke 15. Each week we'll tell at least one of the parables of Jesus. We'll tell at least one of the stories, and then we'll tell some stories about Jesus. Chapter 15 in Luke is famous as the story of the prodigal son, but it is really the story of two sons. Each son gets 11 verses. It's exactly even. And there's three main characters in this story. There's the faithful son, and the prodigal son, and the father. And I would like you to maybe put the little question in your notebook: where am I in all three of these? In other words, in what way am I like the father in this story? In what way am I like the faithful son in this story? And in what way am I like the prodigal son in this story? Because I think we all show up in all three. Let's talk about the context of this story, which comes as one of three parables. And all three of them are about the same thing. Then drew near to him all of the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And I'm now in the King James Version of chapter 15 of Luke. "And the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners and eateth with them." And so this, once again, we're talking about the law. Now, when we talk about the covenant and becoming covenant people, the way you showed that you were one of the covenant people was by obeying the commandments, was by obeying the law. You got circumcised, your family observed the Sabbath, you dressed a certain way, you acted a certain way, and bit by bit these laws grew up. Along with the laws over the generations, there began to be something called hedge laws, or shield laws. In other words, there were laws that grew up that you kept so that you wouldn't accidentally break one of the really important commandments. For example, if you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, well, then that means you're not supposed to write anything. And so people would wear a pen or a stylus attached to their shirt so that they wouldn't do the work of picking up the pen, because that might be interpreted as actually you're going to write. So there began to be all these little hedge laws around the laws themselves. And when Jesus says, you put a hedge around the law, he's not just kidding. He's talking about a whole set of laws that are kept in order not to break the laws. And this is the publicans and sinners who say, the publicans and scribes who say, this man eats with sinners. Now, Jesus may have been obeying the dietary laws, but he sat down to eat with people who perhaps did not. And so that's kind of a hedge law. In other words, you not only have to keep the dietary laws, you better not ever have lunch with somebody who isn't keeping the dietary laws, because then that makes you a sinner. And so Jesus, you would think, would say something about eating with sinners, but instead he tells three stories about things that are lost. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after that which is lost until he find it? And when he hath found it, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and his neighbors, saying unto them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say unto you that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons which need no repentance. Now, why would Jesus tell that story? I'm just asking if you have a thought. Why would he tell that story after them complaining about him eating with sinners? What does that have to do with it? Sounds like a missionary story. Yes? So he's talking to the people who understand the story about the sheep. But why talk about lost sheep? We're talking about eating with sinners. Yes?
Well, what he's saying is you don't just ignore the sinners, you go after them.
If you place yourself in a position where
You're going to separate yourself, then how
Yep.
are they going to come home?
Yeah. So if you place yourself in a position where you never get around any sinners, how are you ever going to affect any sinners? In other words, you guys are hanging with the 90 and 9, but someone's lost. And the only way I'm going to find that lost person is to actually go find that lost person. Dan Clark, who's a motivational speaker, gave a wonderful story one time about when he was on a mission in Ireland. And they called on a lady who, this is Ireland, and, not everybody's interested in the church. And they called on a lady who immediately invited them in, called them elders, so they knew she knew who they were, and was very kind to them and listened to their message. And finally, Elder Clark said to her, I just have to ask you, how do you know so much about us? And she said, oh, I'm a member of the church. I was baptized many years ago. I accepted the gospel and I was baptized. And she said, and I loved it. But she said, I just couldn't get over my smoking habit. I just couldn't get over it. And every Sunday when I went to church, everyone would look at me. I knew I smelled bad. And you can smell it, can't you? If there was somebody in here who'd been smoking, we'd probably smell it. And she said, I just knew I smelled bad. And I got looks, and it didn't seem like anyone wanted to sit right next to me. And she said, eventually I just stopped going. And then she sat there for a minute, and the tears started to come down her cheeks. And she said, Elder, I wish everybody else's sins smelled. We'd have to have the room full of Glade, wouldn't we, if all of our sins smelled as bad as tobacco? But that's a pretty sweet and telling reminder that we might be a little like these scribes and Pharisees who surround ourselves with people like ourselves and get pretty uncomfortable when we're around people who are not like ourselves. Craig's mission president said he wished he could put a sign over every chapel that said smokers welcome, because he just felt like if smokers felt welcome, everybody would feel welcome, because that was the one thing that you could kind of notice. And I really do, I live in a ward, I'm sure all of you do, that I've found remarkably open and welcoming to anybody who comes in the door. And I noticed that from the first time we came to our ward. And I love that about the church, and I love that about all of you. I just think that we can always be reminded, if we get in a position where we're pretty much just taking casseroles to each other, we're off track. We need to get to dinner and get to social situations and get however we can outside the circle. I think that's what he's trying to say there. Next one, I say to you, so then we got joy over that. Now we're going to talk about money, and we all get this. What woman having 10 pieces of silver, you ever lost your wedding ring? Oh. Our son Evan lost his wedding ring like practically the minute he got married. I mean, it was not, he had not been married very long. And he and his wife were at the beach, and he wasn't just quite sure on the size of the ring yet, and the ring came, his hands got cold and the ring came off. He lost his wedding ring in the ocean and found it. I'm telling you right now, he thought that it must have come off when he had been over and was doing something in the sand, and he literally just went and looked and looked and looked and looked, and doggone if he did not find that ring buried under a few inches. He found his wedding ring. So he totally gets this parable. Either what woman having 10 pieces of silver, if she lose one piece, does not light a candle and sweep the house and seek diligently until she find it. These are the kind of things that make me love Jesus. I see a little boy either watching his mother sweep the house diligently or sweeping the house diligently for his mother. He knows what it is to sweep a house. And when she has found it, she calls her friends and her neighbors together, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the piece which I had lost. Now, all of a sudden, he's drawn all the men in who tend to be pastoral shepherds, and he's drawn all the women in who've all lost something in the housekeeping and try to think to herself, how am I going to explain to my husband I lost 1/10 of our family net worth? Likewise, I say unto you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repented. So here he is. He's off. You know, that's the thing that's so great. You'll ask him a question and he'll answer something, it sounds like something else. And it makes you have to think, why are we talking about that? Okay? So now, the parable of the prodigal son. We're going to go slow through this. And I'm not only going to try to talk about the meaning of it, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the construction of it. It is one of the most beautifully constructed pieces of literature that exists in the world. 22 verses. We begin with verse 11. A certain man had 2 sons. So it's a story about 2 sons. And the younger of them said, now that takes us in resonance to everything we've learned about the younger son in the Old Testament, where many, many, many times it's the younger son who, for one reason or another, is favored by the father. You know, for some reason they don't like these oldest sons, but they like the younger one, you know. They like Jacob, and they like Joseph, and they like these younger sons. And it bothers the older sons. They say, hey, I'm the heir. How come you don't like me? The younger one said to the father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. This is not totally out of the realm of possibility. Commentators tell us that it was not totally unheard of for a father to liquidate some of his holdings and allow the sons to hold that portion before he died. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And that's where the word prodigal comes from. A prodigal is wasteful. And it isn't sinful. It's wasteful. And that word that is used, wasted his substance, can be translated as that word prodigal. And they're not specific, riotous living. Maybe he's a gambler. However, it's very interesting that his brother is imagining what he's doing out there and has an interpretation that is not actually listed in the scripture. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. That's kind of living from paycheck to paycheck, isn't it? Where we spend all, then we get paid and we spend all, and we get paid and we spend all. So there's a lesson to us, right? Because if there begins to be a famine or a recession, we will begin to be in want. And so right there is a whole lesson on provident living that we could teach our families one night if we felt like it. We could have a little family lesson, and you get to be the son, and you have 5 pennies, and every time you use it, and then all of a sudden we can create a situation where that money is needed. We teach a little prodigal lesson. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. So he's a Jew, but he has gone into a far country, meaning he's not going to be where there are Jews. And and how do we know that the guy that he works for isn't a Jew? Pigs. He's a swineherd. So if you just want to pick something, now here we are. How interesting is this? That man eateth with sinners. You know, they might have been serving pork at dinner. Jesus gets back to that dietary law, doesn't he? He gets there. He went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine. Horrible, like fate worse than death for a Jew. Now, let's talk a little bit about poetic construction. A thing that you do in Hebrew poetry, it doesn't rhyme, right? And so you can do rhythms, and they really still are not quite sure how to translate Hebrew poetry and make it come out sounding like it would be beautiful for Hebrews. So the translators of the King James Version of the Bible, who were contemporaries of Shakespeare, this came out in 1611, and Hamlet is 1603. This is all right during the time that Romeo and Juliet is 1593. All of these things are being written at the same time. This was the golden age of English literature. I mean, there's no time when the English language has been used more beautifully. However, now it's 400 years old, or 500 years old, so it's hard to get it. But it is used beautifully. So what they're doing poetically is, and you might want to try this if you like to write poems now and then, rather than rhyming the ends of words, they're rhyming the interior of words, and they're rhyming the beginnings of words, so that you have a sense of it flowing, and you have a sense of meter, but it isn't like, I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. It's not that obvious, right? Here's a very poetic line. And he would fain have filled his belly Okay, fain and filled, start with an F. His belly with the husks that the swine did eat. The husks that the swine did eat. That's almost like trying to say toy boat. It's a difficult thing to spit out. And no man gave unto him. And that is like, it's as bad as it can be. I'm down to monosyllables. Okay, he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. That's beautiful rhythm. And it's beautiful what they call internal rhyme and alliteration. Alliteration is when the beginning of the word matches, and internal rhyme we'll get to again, but when the inside of the word matches. And it's beautiful. And when he came to himself, this is the great turning point of the story. And so we wait, like the city of Jericho, marching around the walls, we wait for that moment when the child comes to himself. We don't get to take him there as much as we want to. Years before the child comes to himself, years before everything is wasted, we could have told the kid if they would have only listened. But there's this process in life, isn't it? You don't hear till you hear it. You don't feel it till you feel it. When he came to himself, that's a beautiful phrase, he said, "How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants." So he's finally thought of a way home. He's thought of a way to face it. Have you ever rehearsed what you were going to say to somebody, like your husband or your kid? Or, I mean, if you haven't, I have. Okay, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, it never works that way, and it doesn't work that way for him exactly. He doesn't get all the way through the speech, but I love Jesus for taking us into the heart of this boy and saying, here he was sitting in with the husks and thinking, okay, here's what I'm going to say. And he rehearses this, I imagine, to himself all the long way home. "And am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants." And he arose and came to his father. Now, well, we'll just read the line. "But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him." Let me just quickly read you the internal rhymes. When yet great way, father saw, had compassion, ran, fell, neck, kissed him. Not an accident, is it? If you look, the vowels are in line. So I have underlined in my book, when yet, great way, father saw, had compassion, ran, fell, neck, kissed him, even ends in a kiss, kissed him, ends in a closed consonant. That's pure artistry. And that beautiful line, "And when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him," is so beautiful to say. It's as beautiful to say as the sentiment that it expresses. Now let's read in chapter 33 of Genesis again. I don't want to make you flip around, but here's what they say again. Verse 4, and he lifted up his, verse 4, "And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him." That's no accident. So we are asked to look back and say, Esau is an example to us of how a person should act when someone comes to them and begs forgiveness. So he starts to try to make his speech. "I'm no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants." I'm already there. Okay, 21. "And the son says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son." And that's as far as he gets. But the father says to his servants, "Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand," a ring to symbolize he is a member of this family, "and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again, and he was lost and is found." And they began to be merry. Now when Jesus is telling this story, the people are thinking of the coin and the sheep. And now he said, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that boy. I'm talking about that child of yours that you don't speak to anymore because they've been so offensive and left the church, and they've just made it so hard for everyone. And you're so happy they moved all the way to New York that you don't have to see them very often. And when they do come, it just ruins everything, because like we all feel the same way, and then here's this kid, or here's this uncle, or here's this aunt, who is just hard. That's who he's talking about, that person who's not comfortable to have in the circle. So it's easier to edge the circle closed and just keep the people in the circle who are really comfortable for us. So now we have the other 11 verses. And now his elder son was in the field, and he came and drew nigh to the house, and he heard the music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And you know, you've all seen Downton Abbey. The servants love to dish out the news about the family and put the gossip around and cause a little dissension, you know. So the servant kind of lets him have it a little bit. He says, thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf. And this is to, a little resonance makes us think of how the father said, this my son was dead. So that the servant says to him, yeah, your father, you know, he always liked the other guy better. He has killed the fatted calf because he has received him safe and sound. So the brother was angry and would not go in. So he's actually sulking in the field outside during the party. Therefore, what does the father do? Does he say, let him sulk? Had it with that kid. Is that what he does? He comes out. When he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and ran. When he was out sulking in the field, his father saw him and came out crawling through the furrows in his nice clothes to talk to him. Don't you feel that way as a parent, that you're just endlessly going out trying to get somebody back into the circle? But that's what we do, okay? His father came out and entreated him. And he answering him said to his father, he's very mad. Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandments. And yet thou never gavest me a kid that I might marry with my friends. And as soon as this thy son, not my brother, thy son, this is what parents say, right? Your son has wrecked the car. You know, it's only your son when something goes wrong. Was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots. See, this is what he was imagining his brother was doing. Now, it doesn't say that's what his brother was doing, but it's maybe what he would have done with the money. Thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. So his imagination, just gets there. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother, and he brings it right up. This isn't my son, it's your brother. It takes us all the way back to Cain and Abel. Was dead and is alive again, and he was lost and he is found. Okay, so there's a beautiful, beautiful story. And so let's talk about what it means for us. The thing that I was just teaching you about is called resonance or illusion, but particularly resonance, a little difference between resonance and illusion. Illusion is that they may particularly refer to an actual event, and resonance is just that it sounds like something we've heard before on purpose. And so when we fell on his neck and kissed him and wept, Jesus knows this story, and he is having people think of Jacob and Esau. He's using resonance. So M. Catherine Thomas, who I love, and if you like to read, I don't know, if you haven't read M. Catherine Thomas, if you sort of like me, you'll probably like her. She's a wonderful writer about the gospel, and she, as I've said, she's the only person I've ever read who quoted Deepak Chopra and Brigham Young on one page. I love that. You know, she's just kind of all over the board, but she's pretty awesome. And brings a convert's perspective to the gospel, and a deeply, a very sweet Christian approach, and also has a great deal to teach you about how meditation and calming your mind can add in. The book I like the best of hers is called The Light in the Wilderness, and I totally recommend it. And in that she says this: my challenge is to see that each tangled relationship and each stressful situation has a personal message for me, to recognize that each is seeking to teach me something that I need to know. The major purpose of the mortal probation is to learn, not to create unblemished perfection. So we have this ideal that our families are going to be wonderful and that everything is going to work out great, and the ideal gets smashed continually, but that's the point of it, and because that is the point, is to keep creating that ideal again. In other words, it's supposed to be messy. I think as we think about ourselves as the prodigal son, and everybody's got a prodigal in the family. That one's not hard to recognize. Maybe it's hard to recognize ourselves as the prodigal son. In what way are you like the prodigal son? Anyone want to confess? I mean, when you're reading this and I asked you to say, what way are you like the prodigal son? Can you think ways that you are prodigal? Well, then you're all great. All of you are the faithful son. Am I the only one that wastes time? Oh, baby. I'm sorry, I don't have that problem. I'm sorry, you do. No. Yeah. Sometimes we like to be the center of the attention. Have you ever felt resentful? You guys are killing me. No, you're all so righteous. Have you ever felt resentful of a sibling who got more attention or better than you? Yes, somebody.
I'm just going to say, like Christ, we all are challenged with moments of Christ. Our pride comes first.
Yeah. Did your parents treat everyone fairly in the family? Or were you not in a regular family? Did you ever feel resentful that, I had this little sister whom I adore, but, the ones that come later get everything, right? And I was one of the ones along the beginning. I'm the fifth of 8, but, by the time they got down to just 2 or 3 kids left in the home, and then dad's business is finally going well, you know how it goes, and then they get stuff. And, stuff that we would have never even thought of asking for, like a semester abroad or something like that. We would have never even thought of even asking, Can I go to Austria? Sure. You know what I mean? Really? Maybe it's just me, but, other people must have some of those feelings. Who else has it? I want to hear from some prodigals, yes?
So when I grew up, it was just me and
Stand
my
up.
brother. And I was kind of a cute little girl.
You still are.
Star, And then my brother gets married.
Oh.
And marries this beautiful, darling girl.
Uh-huh.
Everybody is really thrilled with her. And I'm even starting to think, my mom loves her.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really thought that because they were so thrilled.
They probably try to make her feel welcome, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Very easy.
I finally went to my mom and said, I had a feeling this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was good that we talked about it.
Right.
She's like, you're my daughter. You'll always be my daughter.
She did the father thing right there. You're my own daughter, and all that I have is yours, but it is meet that we should be married because this lady came into the family, and we got to make her feel welcome, and, blah, 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 blah. And we fatted the calf, and we had a reception and things. I mean, we had the tri-tip, we had the salads. Okay, prodigal, see, I'm trying to get you. You really don't want to be in this story, do you? Who else has been a little bit proud? I'm not going to let you off the hook, because we all know about being the faithful one, yeah.
So I have a brother that's in the middle of my family that he always got my dad's attention.
There you go.
And to this day, I'm very resentful.
Yeah.
And part of it was that his brother asked for things, and he got it.
Well, that's the thing. No. How did they know how to do that?
But he did, and he just expected, and so he got.
Yeah.
And so I'm still it's very.
Yeah, I'm already mad at him, and I don't even know him. Yeah. Yes.
I'm the oldest of 8 kids in my family, and as a result,
I'm sorry for you, because I'm the 5th of 8 children, and even that was hard. Yeah.
and so I had a lot of responsibility. I missed spring breaks because my parents would go on a trip, and I would stay home and watch the kids.
Oh.
I was like 15 and 16. I swore up and down I would never, ever, ever do that to my kids. Well, it turns out I have triplets, and so I was never, and those are my only kids, and I was never able to let the older one babysit the younger one or anything. And so
You were forced to be fair. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I have 5 brothers, 4 older brothers and 1 just younger than me, and then me in the middle. And the 6 of us came fairly quickly, and then there were 2 more that came down the road. But we'd all go out to dinner. It was very rare. On Fast Sunday, we went to Sir George's Smorgasbord. That's what we did, so my mother didn't have to cook. And so that may be a hedge law now, but at the time, my parents felt like it was in the purview of the commandments that they went to Sir George's Smorgasbord on Fast Sunday. But anyway, and I remember one time we went somewhere else, maybe it was Sizzler or something, and we all knew. I mean, there was like an unspoken law. You ordered the cheapest thing. I mean, and I just remember my middle brother one time saying, "Can I have steak?" And I mean, to this day, the shock that went around the table, everyone looked, and my father just sat there and stared at him and went, "Okay." And we all looked at each other like, "I can't believe it. You know, how did he do that? You know." There's all those things in families. There were 4 boys before me, and my brother Alan, we all were laughing. You know, there's always things to laugh about at a funeral, but Dave Barry says, there are a couple of places you should never laugh, and one of them is a funeral unless you just can't help it. And so we were at my mother's funeral, and each one of us spoke. And my brother Alan, who's just older than I am, well, there's 4 boys, and you know, in those days you don't know what you're having. And by the time she had a 4th boy, my mother, who doesn't cover her feelings real well, was a little disappointed. And so, but she's raising, she loves him and adores him. But anyway, but then when I came, I really was kind of a big deal because it was after 4 boys. And so Alan's still mad, you know. And so at the funeral, he said, and then my brother Steve, one of the middle brothers, took care of her for the last 10 years of her life. And so Alan told the story where he came to see her just a couple of days before she died, and she was asleep, and she woke up and she said, "Stevie? Oh, Alan." All of those feelings are very strong in families, and when you're young, they can really be a big, big deal. So let's talk just a little bit about how we forgive, some of those long-held grudges in particular. David Ridge says, true forgiveness is not an action after the fact, it's an attitude with which you enter each moment. So this is one little insight I'd like to share with you about forgiveness, and that is that if you go into situations thinking there's probably going to be something here I need to forgive, so I'm already ready. I'm going to forgive even before I know I need to forgive. A great example of this I heard in a talk one time, and I've never forgotten it. A young woman, she was a BYU student, a married BYU student, told a story about how she had a neighbor who continually borrowed things from her, would come over and borrow a head of lettuce. And she said it seemed that she watched out the window to see when I bought groceries because she'd show up, you know, soon, and she'd borrow something from me. And so she just began to be so angry that she really, you know, it just began to be a real problem. Couldn't forgive her for it. And so she finally thought one day, well, maybe I ought to go into the situation ready to forgive. And so she started to think, what are the things that she has borrowed the most? And they seemed to be milk and lettuce. She was always out of lettuce and she was always out of milk. So she started buying an extra container of milk and an extra head of lettuce. And she bought one every week. And then she would sort of hope her neighbor would come by. So we might think to ourselves, rather than just acting so bowled over when the person on the phone is rude to us, you know, when we're trying to get our credit check or something, I'm going into this situation, and this is probably going to be, there's probably going to be something I have to forgive during this phone call. So I'm ready. I'm going into it with my Christian armor on, you know, as opposed to being just shocked and getting so mad. Joseph is a great example of this. He starts out, I'd like you to go back and read the story of Joseph again. When you get to that great chapter where he forgives his brothers, if you read, he didn't start out meaning to forgive his brothers. What he started out doing was meaning to, first of all, deceive them into, you know, he didn't let them know who he was. And then he tries to trick them into getting his father and his little brother to him and get rid of the rest of them. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to push the ones out of the circle that he doesn't want there and get the ones he wants there in. I'm happy to forgive those people I really love, but there are certain people I'm just not ever going to forgive, and I'm going to organize my life so that they're not in it. And then you read that story, and you watch how Heavenly Father forces him to forgive, brings him further and further and further into that situation. And at that moment when he says, "Does my father yet live?" and he says it in Hebrew, and his brothers understand who he is. and he's weeping. I mean, I can't read that story without weeping because his heart just opens up. I am Joseph. He finally says who he is. To me, the great lesson of that story is you're never going to know who you are until you forgive the people you can't forgive. You will always be a little bit of a stranger to yourself because you're always going to have to give big explanations to yourself about why you're doing what you're doing. It's too tiring. Forgiveness, said Corrie ten Boom, is an act of the will. And the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Life becomes easier when you learn to accept that apology you never got. I really love that one. We don't wait until the apology comes. We forgive because to not forgive poisons our own souls. And her great story about that, which I know I've told you before, but I'll just tell you the short version of how, she was in a concentration camp and her sister died as a result of the mistreatment they suffered there. And then she later went around to church groups and spoke about forgiveness and about her survival. And one time when she was speaking, she looked up and saw moving through the crowd the guard who had been their worst tormentor in the concentration camp. And as he came forward, she could see her sister with her thin skin and bones body just wasting away, the dearest person in her life, and how he had this riding crop that he used to hit them with, and he used to beat them and just take delight in it. And here came this man through the crowd. And he says to her, I was in the same camp as you. I was a guard, but now I'm a Christian and I've been forgiven, and put out his hand to shake her hand. And she said she just stood there and thought, I cannot ever forgive this person. And then she thought, well, maybe I could put out my hand. And so she put out her hand. She made that one act of will. And she said as she took his hand, it came through her just like an electric shock. Love and forgiveness and peace and healing. And that's a great reminder to us that we can no more forgive other people than we can forgive our own sins. We have not got the power to do it. It's a simple gift from God. So we need to pray that we will be able to forgive the people against whom we have a grudge, because it's poisoning our souls. It's not good for us. It's not good for those around us. And it definitely is not what our Heavenly Father wants us to do. He makes the whole Lord's Prayer contingent on this one thing. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. I mean, there's no wiggle room in that at all. If you take your gift to the altar, he says, and you find that you have aught against your brother, put your gift down, leave, tell the children to be good, leave sacrament meeting, go make the call, get it forgiven. He puts this first. I think you'll be amazed. I'm going to ask you as you go ahead and read through the Gospels to just, all of the places he talks about forgiving other people. It's really overwhelming. Well, I decided we need a formula for forgiveness because we have one for prayer and we have one for repentance, and so I made one up. This is just, you can make up any one you want, but I think you need a sort of a thing to go about it, okay? And here's a couple of things I've learned about trying to forgive people. One, stop counting up all the stuff they do wrong. My daughter has taught me a great, great lesson, which is, Mom, don't make a story of it. I love to make a story about everything, And then when somebody treats me badly, I like to make a big story about it. And if I get a laugh or if I get a reaction, I'll tell it again and again and again. I never get tired of hearing my own stories. And every time I tell it, it gets more ingrained in my memory and everyone else's. And one day I did something really, really stupid, and I was deeply embarrassed about it. And those are the stories I like best. I like to tell those. But I was very embarrassed about this one thing, and I had said it to Allison, and she said, Mom, that's it. You've told me about it. Don't make a story about it, because you're not going to be able to forgive yourself if you keep telling about this stupid thing that you did. Yes, that was a stupid thing that you did. Leave it. Put it behind. Every time you get it out and give it air, there it is, right? The more you stir a stink, the worse it smells. Instead, you might try counting your blessings. Gratitude is the route to forgiveness. This boy in the field felt no gratitude, did he? You can't see a shred of gratitude in that boy. The boy sitting in the pigsty is full of gratitude for the good life that even his father's servants have. Gratitude is a great key to forgiveness. this very beautiful painting by James Christensen of the 10 lepers. I love the expression on the one leper's face. All of them were healed. 9 of them start to run away, and the one stops and just thinks. And you can just see the gratitude filling his heart. And he turns and comes back to Jesus and prostrates himself and thanks him. Just thanks him. So when you come to the sacrament table or you go to the temple and you think, I shouldn't be involved in this unless I can lose all my bad feelings toward whoever you have bad feelings toward, you might do what the father is trying to do with the boy. Can you remember, son, that you are my son and all that I have is yours? How about if you just kind of list to yourself all that you have, and like Esau, you might say, what I have is enough. You know what? What I have is enough. This other member of the church cheated me, and I lost a lot of money, but I still have enough. I'm alive, I'm breathing, I'm okay, the church is still true, and I'm going to get over it. I'm just going to be over it. This husband of mine cheated on me, and I had to go through a terrible divorce, and I was lied to, and terrible things happened. But guess what? I'm still here. I still have the gospel. Everything is still true. And I can get over this because I have God to help heal me. All that he has is mine. These things have been taken from me, yes, but all that God has is mine. And that spirit of gratitude, I think, helps me when I have to try to forgive. Finally, I'd just like to mention that a nice place to practice forgiveness is at the sacrament table. When we come and take the sacrament, I think one of the nice things it is to do is to say, who haven't I forgiven? Against whom do I have some bad feelings? Melvin Ballard says this beautiful thing: we must come to the sacrament table hungry. There is a spirit attending the administration of the sacrament that warms the soul from head to foot. You feel the wounds of the spirit being healed, and the load is lifted. Comfort and happiness come to the soul that is worthy and desirous of partaking of this spiritual food. So in our families, as we teach about the sacrament, we say, well, you need to think about Jesus. I find that very hard. I'm not sure what to think. But we might think, am I teaching my children how to forgive their brothers and sisters? Am I teaching them steps to take? Think about your own blessings. Try not to make too big of a story of it. Try not to count up all the things your brother does that hurt you. And then on Sunday, when we go to church, why don't you take a minute and pray for your brother or your sister? And let's think about all of us as a family forgiving each other for all the dumb things we've done to hurt each other, because we really wouldn't hurt each other if we knew better. My husband said to me recently, and it was the cutest thing, he said, I can't believe you ever get mad at me, because if you knew that I never mean to hurt you, why would you ever get mad at me? And it was so touching to me, because I thought, well, why would I? Honestly, he loves me, and anything that he does that hurts me is usually just because he's just not aware that it would have. And this may be true of many of you. You may be living in relationships with people who dearly love you and don't mean to hurt you, but do. And do we really need to hash out every single one? I mean, maybe sometimes we can just say, you know what, I just know you'd have never hurt me on purpose. Let's think the best of others. Beautiful quote from Truman Madsen: we are most blessed when we see ourselves as we are seen by the Savior and know ourselves as we are known by him. In this world, we do not really grasp who we are until we know whose we are. He says, I will not forget you. I have graven you on the palms of my hands. He will never forget us or our real identity, and neither should we ever forget whose we are his. As the Father in the field says, you are my son, and everything I have is yours. When we have that in our minds and in our hearts, it's easier to forgive others their trespasses, because surely we've done a lot that is disappointing to our Heavenly Father. And the opportunity to forgive, the chance to forgive, is a blessing from him. It's a gift from him. I pray that as we examine the New Testament, that we will see the prodigal in ourselves, and that we will be able to understand how much we have wasted of the gifts and blessings that God has given us, and that it will open our hearts to be more forgiving of others. And I ask this in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Next week, we'll talk about grace and how God works in our lives as a theme. But I'd like you to just begin reading the Gospels. Just begin with your notebook And everybody, there's one for everybody. And just writing down what touches you and really begin to look for yourselves in that story. Thank you.